Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to part 2 of this video titled The Mulattos and Zambos of the Americas. In this video, I will be going over the mixed African and indigenous populations that exist within some of these countries. Zambo groups are for the most part small minorities within most of these countries and do not constitute a large part of their populations. So if you guys would like to see who these Zambo groups are, just keep on watching. The word Zambo in Spanish or Cafuso in Portuguese were racial terms used to identify individuals of mixed African and Amerindian ancestry. In colonial Mexico, the term lobo, meaning wolf, was applied to those of African and indigenous ancestry. Many Black and indigenous people resisted the colonial powers and mounted many rebellions. Sizable numbers escaped to the remote areas where they joined together and began new communities. Beginning with the Spanish Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, African slaves began mixing with indigenous people from the beginning of their importation into Hispaniola. Many times, this intermixing happened in the mines and plantations of the islands, as well as when runaway slaves, who would be called cimarrones, fled from plantations into the mountains and unconquered indigenous regions. The Taínos, who themselves were under the threat of the encroaching colonizers, were sympathetic to the plight of the fleeing slaves and welcomed them into their communities, offering them food and sanctuary. Today, Black Indians make up a small percentage of the populations of the Dominican Republic as well as Haiti. Similar stories would be those of the runaway slaves and indigenous populations in Puerto Rico and Cuba. In 1527, after the first major slave rebellion in Puerto Rico, slaves who managed to escape retreated to the mountains, where they resided as Maroons with the surviving Taínos. In Cuba, there were also Maroon communities in the mountains who escaped slavery and joined refugee Taínos. Now moving on to the rest of the Caribbean, in 1655, when the English expelled the Spanish out of Jamaica, Taínos were still recorded as living there. Many escaped into the mountains and coexisted with the Maroons, whose descendants today still use many non-African medicinal plants, ones that were once parts of Taíno pharmacology. They also still make hammocks in the Taíno fashion, proving the Taíno did in fact survive for many years after the Spanish left, alongside the runaway slaves in the mountains of inland Jamaica. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is home to the Black Caribs, who are descendants of the original island Caribs as well as enslaved Africans who mixed amongst themselves in the 18th century. The Africans were either refugees from slave ships that wrecked on the reefs or escapees by boat from St. Lucia and Barbados. Others were captured in raids and purchased as slaves by the Caribs. They intermarried and adopted the Carib culture. The resulting Black Caribs develops out of this blending of African and Carib cultures. Their population makes up 2% of the current population of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and they can also be found in Dominica and Trinidad. Dominica is the only Eastern Caribbean country that still has a population of pre-Columbian native Caribs, also known as Kalinago, with about 3,000 Caribs remaining there. Intermarriage between the native Kalinago and the Afro-Dominicans occurred, and the relationship has been a complicated one. Beginning with the cooperation with the runaway slaves during slavery, there was also intermarriage, but also hostility due to certain slaves crossing into their territories. Currently, Dominicans of indigenous descent make up 2.9% of their total population. And now moving on to Mexico. Historically, Mexicans of African descent were primarily the descendants of African slaves who were brought to Mexico, as well as fugitive slaves who escaped from the southern United States. Many of these slaves, along with shipwrecked slaves that came off the coast, would venture into the Mexican highlands and settle with the indigenous populations they found, thus creating Zambo populations. Yanga, Mexico was established by Africans and Amerindians escaping enslavement under the Spanish rule. Most of the country's Afro-descendant population has been absorbed into the mestizo population, and about 9.3% of Afro-Mexicans speak an indigenous Mexican language. The greatest populations of Afro-descended Mexicans can be found around the southern coastal states, such as Guerrero, Oaxaca, Yucatan, and Veracruz. Currently, Mexicans of African descent make up 1.2% of the total population. The most prominent Sambo group in Central America are the Garifuna. The Garifuna are descendants of the Black Carib population of St. Vincent, as well as the indigenous Kalinago Taino, who were exiled to the Honduran coast in the 18th century and subsequently moved to Belize. The highest concentrations of Garifuna people can be found in Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Honduras currently has a population of 100,000 Garifunas living there, mostly in towns along the northern coast. In Guatemala, the small remote town of Livingston on Guatemala's Caribbean coast is the main home to the country's population of Garifunas. Nicaragua also has a population of around 8,000 Garifunas living there. Garifuna culture is very different from that of the rest of Central America. The most famous style of Garifuna music is punta, where dancers move their hips in a circular motion. Punta has a very widespread audience though, as it is many times mixed with Spanish lyrics. Now, if you are Hispanic and over a certain age, it is very likely that you heard the song Sopa de Caracol growing up, which is a form of punta. In South America, Zambos represent small minorities in the northwestern countries of Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, although small pockets of afro-indigenous peoples can be found in Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina as well. In Ecuador, in the unconquered regions of Esmeraldas, a small group of shipwrecked former slaves managed to win control of the indigenous communities and ended up mixing with them. They even went on to represent them before the Spanish authorities in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Sambo populations resulting from the unions of Amerindian men to Afro-Ecuadorian women have not been uncommon in major coastal cities of Ecuador. In Colombia, by the mid-1800s, many slaves had revolted, been awarded freedom, or had escaped. These Africans escaped into the jungles, the Andes regions, the Cauca Valley, or the coastal areas, where they joined the Amerindian communities and formed their own communities together. The largest Sambo communities are San Basilio de Palenque and San Jose de Ure in the Choco or Pacific coast. Sambos have undoubtedly influenced the entire country of Colombia through their music, traditions, and culture. In Brazil, the term cafuso was used to describe people of mixed African and Amerindian ancestry. They are the least numerous group, and most of them are descendants of Black women who escaped slavery and were welcomed by indigenous communities, where they started families with local Amerindian men. And now last but not least, the United States. Now, I don't know if people of mixed African and Amerindian ancestry are called Sambos. I don't think that they are, and I'm not sure if they have a certain name, but for the sake of this video, we'll just continue on. Now, I'm sure many of us have heard at least one Black person here in the United States say that they are part Indian, that their grandmama or their great-grandma was part Cherokee, or whatever the case may be. Now, the truth is that whereas virtually all African Americans have a considerable amount of European ancestry, only 19% have at least 1% Native American ancestry, and only 5% carry more than 2% Native American ancestry. Now, for those that do possess Native American DNA, their story is very similar to that of Latin America, as is the case of the Black Seminoles of Florida. The Black Seminoles are mostly descendants of free Blacks and escaped slaves who allied with the Seminole groups in Spanish Florida. Because slavery had been abolished there by the Spanish in 1693, the territory became a safe haven for runaway slaves. The Spanish also hoped to halt English expansion into the area by encouraging Native Americans and runaway slaves to move into their territory and act as a militia and block them. Many of the Blacks lived separately from the Indians, although intermarriage between the two groups did happen, and so a lot of these Black Seminoles do in fact have Native American ancestry in their DNA.
Seguimos bailando porque intentamos dar a conocer nuestra cultura y a través del baile nosotros pretendemos invitar, atraer a los jóvenes para que se unan a nosotros y así consolidar nuestra cultura, consolidar nuestra propia identidad como pueblo negro.
Wata winegi con su, wata winegi guanaga, wata winegi con su, wata winegi guanaga. Si tú quieres bailar, sopa de caracol.
Alright guys, and that concludes part 2 of the Mulattos and Zambos of the Americas. I hope that you guys enjoyed both of these videos. Give this video a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!